This episode of the Hyrule Journals is titled Hearsay. And like any good detective story, this one begins with a question. A question involving this guy, Nintendo Japan's famous in-house illustrator, Yoichi Kodabe, the artist responsible for some of the world's most recognizable video game characters, Mario, Bowser, and Peach, alongside a career working on other titles like Pokemon and Zelda. For the Legend of Zelda specific community, one of Yoichi Kodabe's greatest claims to fame is his role in spearheading the bold new art style for the Zelda game Wind Waker, a title that sent waves through the fanbase back in 2002 for its anti-realism anime stylistic approach, before going on to achieve cult status in the years after. A quick search for Kodabe Wind Waker yields no shortage of results, all praising Kodabe for his hands-on involvement in making Wind Waker look the way it does. So here's the question I mentioned at the beginning. Why is it that despite the praise of his involvement in spearheading Wind Waker's art direction, Yoichi Kodabe appears nowhere in the game's credits? Well, the answer to this might be the most obvious one in that Kodabe, despite the wide belief of his involvement, never worked on Wind Waker. An interview between Kodabe and French magazine Le Monde provides a sense of closure to the misinformation when Kodabe straight up addresses the rumors of his involvement, saying, "I often hear that, but I had nothing to do with that game." So perhaps our question needs a quick rearrangement. Why is it that despite Yoichi Kodabe appearing nowhere in the game's credits, is he praised for his involvement in spearheading Wind Waker's art direction? Well, the answer to this new question is both far more compelling and far more complicated, but ultimately highlights a curious problem that exists in all hype journalism, of which Zelda-specific journalism is unfortunately not immune to. After spending a few days scouring the internet, I reverse-engineered a timeline of how this piece of fiction came to be, and it all happened within a matter of hours in 2018. At the beginning of it all was this tweet from French video game and book publisher Pix'n'Love on November 8, which, when translated from French, reads, "In the latest Famitsu, Yoichi Kodabe looks back on his career at Nintendo and gives an interesting anecdote about Zelda Wind Waker. The film The Little Prince and the Eight-Headed Dragon from the Toei studio would have greatly influenced the art director of the game. Watching the film, it's obvious." Now, everything in this tweet was true. In the Famitsu article mentioned, which was released on the Japanese website about a month earlier, Kodabe and the interviewer do discuss the likeness between Wind Waker and The Little Prince, the film that Kodabe did work on as a key animator back in 1963. But the ironic part to this in relation to this investigation is that Kodabe outright denies his involvement in Wind Waker here at the beginning. But this fact seems to have been bypassed by every journalist that picked the story up, because when Edition's Pix'n'Love's tweet dropped on November 8, entertainment journalists shared only the tweet, and not the Famitsu article itself. The UK's Jewel Shockers, Mexican publication Level Up, Brazil's Traco Box, and The Enemy, to name a few, all sharing their tweet in their write-ups. But then other publications began to inject new pieces of information into the story. The biggest of these being India's massive online hub Gaming Bolt, and the US's equally, if not more enormous comicbook.com, who both shifted up the language and promoted Kodabe's role from influencer to Wind Waker's own designer and animator. With the Gaming Bolt headline reading, "The Legend of Zelda The Wind Waker animator reveals inspiration for the game's look," and the comicbook.com write-up reading, "The Legend of Zelda Wind Waker's animator reveals the game's inspiration," going on to say at that time, when he joined up with Nintendo, he worked on Wind Waker and found some very interesting inspiration. But things didn't stop there. These two articles went on to influence a whole new set of articles who would run with this new information of Kodabe being directly involved on the Wind Waker project. IGN Brazil would write, "The movie The Little Prince and the Eight-Headed Dragon was one of the biggest influences for anime Kodabe when developing the game." And South America's Player1.vg article reading, in an interview with the Famitsu site, the game's main designer and animator Yoichi Kodabe commented that his inspiration for its quirky landscapes and characters was based on his previous work from when he worked at Toei Animation. It's a fascinating case of snowball journalism. When one piece of news grows and grows, the more it gets passed around. In this case, the news snowballed so quickly that it grew into something of fiction. But even this isn't the end of the snowball's journey, because it would eventually land on the desk of ZeldaUniverse.com, whose write-up of this story, which would be the first article to contain the whole spearheaded phrase, would go on to have the greatest impact on the internet. Wind Waker's animator reveals his inspiration for the game. The new art style was spearheaded by Yoshi Kodabe. From here, websites like TV Tropes, Answers to All, and others began to use the Zelda Universe article as the source of their information, while Zelda's own community-run fandom page would reference not the original tweet or the Famitsu article, but the Zelda Universe article, all while being passed around other publications like Katsuka on Twitter. So even now, this piece of Zelda trivia that Yoshi Kodabe spearheaded the art style for Wind Waker still floats around the wider Zelda development mythology, despite being completely untrue.
Hi, my name is Brian Thomas. I used to be a news reporter for Zelda Universe and switched over to doing podcast segments. I am now a graphic designer outside of the industry, unfortunately.
A few months after gathering all this research, I brought this entire investigation to the attention of Brian Thomas, the author responsible for the Zelda Universe write-up, in the hopes of some sort of statement regarding how the story got picked up. He was shocked to hear about the story not being true, and was more than helpful in filling me in on how it all went down on his end back in 2018. He was very humble and sincere, which was a wonderful surprise.
The story was honestly just like any other story. It was on the Trello board. The kind of headlines were he was inspired by a movie in the 60s, and with that unique art style for Wind Waker, in my artistic background, I was like, oh, this is perfect. I'd love to talk about this. The story itself, I just remember picking up, writing, and doing the back and forth with the editor and just sending it on its way. I've never given that story a second thought before you reached out to me.
So now that we have actual proof that Kodabe never worked on Wind Waker, do you have any thoughts or feelings about your own write-up back from 2018?
I mean, yeah, obviously, when you first sent it over to me and the kind of discovery that it wasn't true is hugely disappointing, right? I want to say, first and foremost, as a news reporter, that it's gone this long and it's still kind of used as a, no, look, hey, he actually did work on it, is really kind of sad. In all honesty, it's kind of scary, right? Because it's misinformation, it's incorrect. And I think that kind of having that transparency of man, I wish I did catch this.
So even though you weren't the first to get this wrong, did you have any thoughts on the whole snowball effect of journalism like this, or any thoughts on the ethics of reporting rumors in this day and age?
As a news reporter, I think that you should be reporting on any news that could be important to your audience. I think that in this day and age, we have everything at our fingertips. And so I think that most of your audience, especially for something like Zelda Universe, which is a very highly focused publication, everyone is following them for Zelda news. And so any sort of rumor, any sort of whisper that's kind of circulating, they're going to want to know about it. Now, whether or not that's true or it's based in, fiction, they're going to want to know something about it.
But in defense of Brian Thomas and all the other publications that got this wrong, this one was an easy one to mix up. The false facts of this story are so close to the true ones that they're almost indistinguishable from each other. For example, the art director who did spearhead Wind Waker's art direction, Satoru Takezawa, mentioned in an interview that the struggle to find Wind Waker's art direction ended when they saw a Toei-inspired drawing of Link. Then one day, out of the blue, Harahana-san hit us with that new Link. Now, Yoshiki Harahana, the artist behind this Link drawing, is another one of Nintendo's in-house illustrators who took over from Kodabe when he stepped off the Zelda series back in 1998. And confusing the situation even more is that Harahana was an artist who worked under Kodabe's illustration advisory, as seen on titles like Super Mario World 2. Another point of confusion is that in a completely separate interview from 2013 on Japanese gaming website 4Gamer, Wind Waker's director, Eiji Aonuma, likens the game's style to the animated film Animal Treasure Island, yet another film Kotobe worked on back in 1971 that sees a boy travel across the seas in a small boat. Around this time, Kotobe had made a name for himself developing stylized waves for animation that would eventually go on to be dubbed the Kotobe wave, with the flat, solid color and the white seafoam lines, and this was also another element that made its way into Wind Waker. So at this point, the truth of this story is fairly obvious now. The fiction of Yoichi Kotobe's involvement on Wind Waker was spearheaded by entertainment journalists. And this would almost be case closed if it weren't for a curious little interview from 2012 that suggests that a version of this rumor might have been circulating years before. During a 2012 interview between Siliconera and the director of Skulls of the Shogun, Jake Kasdal, Jake talks about how Wind Waker had inspired the art direction of his game, before going on to talk about how he'd been told that Wind Waker was inspired by Toei films from the 60s. Jake continues to say, "This has apparently been disproven. Someone told me that it isn't true. But Hotta-san told me that one of the art directors from these old movies came out of retirement to help art direct, or at least do some of the concept stuff for Wind Waker." After a bit of trial and error, I managed to get in touch with both of them separately in the hopes of finding out more about this part of the story. But we'll have to wait to see on whether or not they can shed some light on how this version of the rumor began circulating a whole 6.5 years before the PixnLove tweet. So where does this leave us in the end? Well, in all honesty, it leaves this investigation still a bit open-ended. While we managed to answer the question of how Kotobe's name got tangled up in the Wind Waker development mythology, we're left with a few more questions about why this rumor keeps resurfacing throughout the decades. But for the time being, I'd rather leave it at that, because if I can't truly verify my sources, anything I report here would be nothing more than hearsay.